From deep in the darkness of the Immaterium appears an unknown vessel. Its battle-scarred and blackened hull is only identified as a modified Imperial strike cruiser on account of ancient yet still valid authorization protocols. This surprise new arrival to the monumental conflict known as the Badab War was an uneasy sight for both the loyalist and secessionist forces in this sector, neither side privy to their allegiance just yet. That was until the ship known as the Levitus Vex made contact with the loyalists directly. A voice spoke plainly but precisely, and in a hushed whisper that would unnerve the most staunch of individuals. The voice claimed they were here to answer a summons from Terra itself. As the whisper grew ever more intense, they made a formal request to draw secessionist blood, like a predator that had caught the scent of its prey. Introducing the Carcharodons, sent into the depths of space thousands of years ago to defend mankind against its enemies at the very edge of the Imperium's borders. They now answer the High Lord's call and seek to break, maim and brutalize any who would defy the Emperor's rule, and all in an eerie, deathly silence. The Badab War was about to see the Carcharodons etch a grim name for themselves in Imperial records, all of which were to be written in blood. The Carcharodons, colloquially known as the Space Sharks, are a mysterious chapter of Space Marines, clad in grey power armor adorned with a shark insignia. These savage loyalist warriors have carved a dark and bloody reputation for themselves throughout the Imperium, largely on account of their actions in the Badab War. Their skin assumes a grey pallor to match their armor, their sharp teeth and liquid black eyes serving to associate them with their namesake. Their bloodthirsty methods and a total disregard for civilian casualties during battle help to set them apart as one of the most ferocious chapters within the ranks of the Adeptus Astartes. The exact origins of this chapter are hard to pin down, but fragmented historical data suggests they have existed since the 32nd millennium, where they were given a sacred duty to travel to the far reaches of space beyond the borders of the Imperium to seek out and destroy all enemies of mankind. It is widely thought that the chapter is partially descendant of the Raven Guard elements that were exiled during the Great Crusade. Similar in ways to the Carcharodons, these Raven Guard warriors were experts in guerrilla warfare, stealth tactics, and most importantly, precise applications of overwhelming force, while those on the receiving end of a Carcharodon strike would be forgiven for believing them bloodthirsty berserkers. Their combat doctrine makes use of a series of tactics that are both simple and effective, prioritizing the use of fast-moving vehicles, drop pods, or teleportation to overwhelm the enemy in lightning-fast assaults. Due to their almost non-existent presence in Imperial records, very little is known about the history of the Carcharodons, and what is documented tends to come from first-hand accounts told by those unfortunate enough to witness what they are capable of. As they travel on the fringes of Imperium space, the Carcharodons employ unconventional and fittingly brutal means of recruiting new members. They deploy what is known as the Red Tithe, where members of the chapter will descend on an Imperial world, harvesting young aspirants from the population and subjecting them to psycho-indoctrination and a series of grueling trials, where the most promising candidates will be inducted as initiates and fully trained in the chapter's merciless combat doctrine. Most, however, will not meet the standard to become an initiate and are taken as slaves or serfs and put to work across the chapter's fleet. Along with Red Tithes, the Carcharodons have also been known to negotiate recruitment of fresh initiates directly from the renegade Ashen Claws, another exiled Space Marine chapter descendant from the Raven Guard, although their relations are often strained between the leadership of the Carcharodons and these renegade Black Shields. The Carcharodons are led by their enigmatic chapter master, referred to within his chapter as the Shade Lord, Tyberos the Red Wake. Never seen outside of his archaic suit of tactical dreadnought Terminator armor, heavily modified to fit his hulking form, he stands tall enough to dwarf those around him, even his Astartes brothers. His ceramite armor is adorned with skulls dangling from a metal chain around his waist, being so ancient that the bone has begun to yellow. Armed with two powerful gauntlets known as Hunger and Slake, they each possess a trio of barbed power blades to inflict maximum damage upon flesh and an inner maw lined with twin-linked chain blades covered in viciously sharp teeth. Using the immense power of these gauntlets, Tyberos carves his way through hordes of enemies with extraordinary speed and precision, leaving nothing but maimed and mangled corpses behind him. As well as being Shade Lord, Tyberos leads the Carcharodons' most elite force of Terminator veterans, known as the Red Brethren. This fanatically devoted clutch of Adeptus Astartes never remove their armor or lay down their weapons, dedicated solely to carrying out the orders of their Shade Lord at any cost. Tyberos leads his chapter from their flagship, the fabled battle barge Nicor. This heavily modified Grand Cruiser, built during the Great Crusade, has been upgraded with powerful void shields and an unorthodox plasma destructor in place of traditional bombardment weaponry. Along with these combat-focused upgrades, the ship's hangar space has been converted into an array of mass teleporter systems capable of moving entire battle companies at once with extraordinary accuracy. This enables the Carcharodons to launch their favored precision strikes against the enemy of mankind at their weakest possible moment, with only bloody death and destruction to follow. In the year 901 of the 41st millennium, war would erupt in the Badab sector, triggered by a disgruntled Luft Huron who was at the time chapter master of the Astral Claws. Self-appointing himself as the planetary governor after putting down a coup attempt against the previous ruler of the Hive world, and crucially a recruiting world for the Astral Claws, Badab Primaris would now be the seat of Huron's rule, and he would declare the entire sector was now his to watch over and govern, in order to better protect it from further threats. Whilst it wasn't exactly unprecedented for a Space Marine commander to take control of a sector in such a manner, one of the most prominent examples being the Ultramarines governing of the Ultramar sector for instance, it certainly wasn't standard practice, and signalled Huron's departure from behaviour expected by those of his position and standing as a highly respected warrior and leader. While it wasn't the direct cause of the war itself, it was a questionable decision at best, and only served to further increase rising suspicions. Luft Huron would give himself the title of the Tyrant of Badab. In his ongoing push for security in the sector, Huron would petition the High Lords of Terror to send additional reinforcements and allow him to completely subdue the Maelstrom Zone and its surrounding area, leading a crusade planned and led by Huron himself to cleanse the area. Unfortunately for Huron, Imperial forces were needed elsewhere at this time, and the High Lords would see fit to dismiss him without so much as a hearing on the matter. Over the following years, Huron would continue to petition Terra for the reinforcements that he so desperately believed he needed, but they would of course never arrive, and as his frustrations grew, his level of defiance would grow alongside it. In response to the Imperial inaction, he would not only withhold the Imperium's gene seed tithe, but all resources available to him, thus triggering investigations by the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Inquisition that would eventually reveal the Astral Claws were not only attempting experiments in rapid gene seed zygote cultivation, with a goal towards increasing the size of their fighting force far beyond the restrictions laid out in the Codex Astartes, but were also attempting to secretly rebuild their assumed extinct successor chapter, the Tiger Claws, hiding any living members within their own chapter. Continually dismissed by the High Lords of Terror, Huron would grow increasingly disenfranchised and continue to stockpile his resources. Space Marine chapters being reluctant or slow to deliver on gene seed tithes was hardly abnormal behavior, however, and the previously mentioned investigations would not yield results for quite some time, allowing many of Huron's actions to either go unnoticed or simply not draw the concern of high-ranking officials. He would begin to blockade the Badab sector, redirecting its industrial output towards building its defenses into what would become known as the Ring of Steel, restricting trade and refusing the ever-mounting planetary tithe demanded from them. Over the coming century, Huron Huron's grip over the Maelstrom Zone would be continually challenged, with multiple crusades and incursions slowly degrading his authority until an Imperial investigation fleet was sent to the Badab sector to demand the reinstatement of the Badab tithe and enforce the Astral Claw's gene seed toll. The fleet attempted to force its way through the blockade despite multiple warnings from Badab's navy to remain at the edge of the system. Records don't detail exact happenings after this point, but ultimately, the Imperial tithe fleet would not make it past the Ring of Steel. They were fired upon and completely destroyed, vaporizing 20,000 servants of the Imperium in mere moments. This was seen by many as the fuse that ignited the Badab War. Huron maintained that the tithe fleet refused to follow pilot instructions and threatened him with violence. As such, the fleet was therefore treated as a hostile force, as was his right to do so. Regardless of who was to blame, this would place the Astral Claws on a war footing. Huron gathered the other chapters that formed the Maelstrom Warders, permanently responsible for protecting Imperial worlds in the Maelstrom Zone. This included the Lamenters and the Mantis Warriors, who were called to discuss and ultimately sign the Articles of Just Succession, which laid out Huron's plans of severing ties between the Maelstrom Zone and their neighboring sectors. The Carthago sector felt the harshest impact from the signing of these articles, as they were directly responsible for redistributing the output of the now severed trade agreements between them, and would make complaint to any who would listen to their plea. They would be denied aid by the Imperial Naval Command, and so took it upon themselves to petition Space Marine chapters for help directly. The first to respond would be the Firehawks, and unbeknownst to them at the time, they were about to spark an almighty bloodbath between several chapters of the Emperor's finest. Originally sent to investigate the whereabouts of missing Carthan shipping in the Golgothon wastes, the Firehawks would dispatch vessels away from their core objective and into the northern Maelstrom Zone to seek out missing Cartagan fleets. One such vessel, the Red Harbinger, would be sent to the Endymion cluster, which was under the stewardship of the Mantis Warriors, aligned to Huron and part of the secessionist movement. As soon as the Red Harbinger entered the system, they would find themselves surrounded by Mantis Warrior vessels who demanded the Firehawks submit to their authority and allow them to board. Too proud to surrender, this was a demand the Firehawks would refuse. The Mantis Warriors promptly opened fire on the lone vessel, crippling it entirely before beginning to board. The following melee would result in heavy losses for both sides, but for the Firehawks, it would mean ultimate defeat, with few survivors to take prisoner after the bloody massacre aboard the Red Harbinger. While a brief parley was arranged and the few Firehawk prisoners were returned by the Mantis Warriors, the conflict would ultimately only grow from here, with skirmishes aboard individual vessels soon transitioning to all-out planet-side war, which would finally grab the attention of the High Lords, who would then unleash entire chapters of Loyalist Space Marines upon the secessionists, sent to hunt down Huron and his co-conspirators with extreme prejudice. The war would rage for 6 years, with increasing numbers of Loyalist forces joining the fold, and as the Astral Claws and their allies started to falter, the Carcharodons would smell blood in the water. Arriving without warning into the Maelstrom Zone, neither Loyalist or Secessionist forces knew who the Carcharodons were or who they fought for. The first ship to appear in the war-torn sector was the blackened strike cruiser, battered by thousands of years of fighting, and with no obvious identifying marks. The ship used ancient authorization protocols to identify itself as belonging to the Carcharodons Astra, and Tyberos presented the Inquisitor Legate in charge of prosecuting the war with notices patent signed by long-dead High Lords and Inquisitors to prove his right to lead the chapter, even going so far as to submit himself for psychic probing to prove his chapter's loyalties. Tyberos would eventually convince his allies to allow the Carcharodons into the fight, although because of their deviance from the Codex Astartes, many were still wary of their allegiance. Initially deployed to the Endymion cluster, it wouldn't take long for the Carcharodons to leave their bloody mark on the conflict. They would begin systematically tearing through all the planets known to be under the Mantis Warriors' protection, destroying their infrastructure and slaughtering entire populations to force the Mantis warriors to intervene. These brutal tactics were well founded in the reasoning that the Mantis warriors were honor-bound to defend these worlds. Playing right into the Carcharodons' hand, the Mantis warriors abandoned their hit-and-run style of warfare and arrived to face their foe in open battle and defend their people. The massacre that was to follow would leave them utterly crushed, and eventually eliminate them as an effective fighting force for the rest of the Badab War. The Carcharodons were relentless, overwhelming and brutalizing both the Mantis warriors themselves and their worlds on multiple fronts until they were forced to surrender. Their reputation now cemented as bloodthirsty but effective warriors, the Carcharodons would be redeployed to attack the primary infrastructure of Badab Primaris, homeworld of the Astral Claws and the eye of the proverbial storm that had been the ongoing war. True to their nature, the orders they were given were not carried out in an orthodox manner. Instead of any direct attacks, they would sabotage the reactors responsible for powering the planet's hive cities, plunging them into darkness and disabling their power-hungry defense batteries. The destruction of the reactors would cause tectonic upheaval, splitting the ground below the hive cities, toppling the tallest of structures, and engulfing much of the planet in molten lava. The casualties were enormous. The Carcharodons, all in complete silence, would then begin their withdrawal from the planet as it crumbled around them. The Emperor's judgment had been delivered, and the traitors brought to heel. The Carcharodons' efforts would allow for a final assault on the Ashen Claw's main stronghold by other branches of Imperial forces, and this would mark the end of the Badab War. But the Carcharodons were not quite finished yet. Once freed of their duty in Badab, the chapter travelled to the Tranquility System, whose worlds were the primary recruitment and training grounds of the Mantis warriors. Here, they added salt to a gaping wound and enacted a red tithe, harvesting the very populations that the Mantis warriors had sworn to protect, pulling young individuals barely older than children to refresh their losses in the war, and once satisfied, they would once again depart through the warp back to the depths of space to continue their sacred but grim duty, purging all that would dare stand against the will of the Emperor of mankind.